Talking about now is a little bit more getting into, now that we're kind of getting into how heat is going to be produced, and some of the issues that come along with exercise on that one. We're going to start talking a little bit more about the heat loss strategies of the body. So getting into the other half of that, how we can dissipate this heat that we're generating. One of the things that I do want you to notice on this graph, and I just like to show this one for the very simple reason that it kind of shows you with exercise kind of where the heat loss has to come from. You can see at rest, generally you're radiating heat off the body, possibly some convective heat loss depending on the environment around you. But as you start to exercise, you can see convective heat loss goes up a little bit because you're moving. But you can see the big one that jumps way up is this red line right here, which is evaporation. And you can see during exercise and even through recovery, that is going to be the big way by which we dissipate heat. You can see conduction, really not a heat loss strategy that we tap into that much. It can be an issue in cold environments and falling into water. That would be a very big heat loss in that type of instance, but under most cases, it is really kind of negligible what we're going to do with conduction heat loss. So and really when it comes down to acute responses, so again, this is going to be the hypothalamus controlling this. But we know, and most people are aware of this, when you get into a hotter environment, your body tends to do a few different things. We tend to send blood to the surface of the skin. Why? Because we are taking warmer blood, getting to the surface of the skin and dilating blood vessels there, which will allow us to radiate more heat off our body in that condition. The other thing we will start doing is sweating. What you're going to do is use the latent heat from the blood you're bringing to the skin to evaporate that sweat, as well as maybe some environmental heat to do that. Either way, it's going to be pulling heat from either your body or the area right around your body in order to evaporate that sweat, which is going to make you and the area surrounding you slightly cooler when you're sweating. In order to be able to vasodilate and keep blood pressure up, our heart rate is going to go up, and we may be breathing slightly faster. It is one of the ways we can dissipate a little bit of heat, but we are not animals that it's their main heat dissipation. Like if you're looking at a dog, one of its main heat dissipating mechanisms is going to be panting, that hyperventilation almost of blowing that air out. The main reason is, and I think everybody, especially you, and right now when we're wearing masks all the time, I think everybody's aware that your breath is warm, has moisture in it. So if you can exhale more often, you will get heat from the interior of the body, replace it with cooler air that you're bringing back in, which will then get heated up by your tissues, and then you exhale it out again. You can see how you can get rid of some heat that way. And what we're going to do is walk through each of these now a little bit deeper. So again, we are going to increase our sweat rate, and we are also going to vasodilate that surface of the skin. I mean, you really can think about our skin as almost like a radiator on a vehicle. We are sending warm temperature to that area where it's closest to the environment, where there's the most amount of heat exchange that can happen, and putting it right there. Our sweat rate is going to go up as we start to exercise in the heat here, or just be in the heat in general. Again, there is a threshold value which once we get warm enough, which is going to cause blood flow to the skin to increase. And again, moving that warmer blood to a tissue that is colder, we are going to lose some heat to the skin by convection and then radiate that off. Depending on if we start getting into sweat, that's where we get into that insensible heat loss, that we will actually be evaporating that sweat to draw away the heat. As we've said over and over again in a lot of this is dependent upon both your core temperature and your skin temperature. And again, how much we're sending there is going to be proportional to the core temperature, is basically a proportion of the core temperature relative to the skin. If your skin temperature is hotter, what it's going to mean is that increase in blood flow is going to happen at a lower core temperature, if that's the case. So again, if the shell and the core are closer together, it usually means on any of the effects that we're talking about in terms of heat dissipation, that we are going to trigger those sooner. So in the case here, blood flow is going to go up earlier if your skin temperature is hotter than normal relative to the core. So normally you might say there's a 4 degrees Celsius difference. If the difference is only 1 degree Celsius and your skin temperature is much closer to your core temperature, that would lead to that increased blood flow much sooner. And again, moving that blood sooner and having a bigger difference there, these are all things that will help with that heat transfer. So if we move blood faster, it's more convective heat getting moved to a cooler area. Then the conduction of those tissues are going to help get that away from that core and increase heat transfer. Again, as it gets warmer and warmer, what becomes an issue is, I think you get the kind of idea. If you're in an environment that is warmer than you, you can't radiate heat to that environment. Radiation at that point becomes a heat gain. So as ambient temperature surrounding you gets hotter and hotter, we are going to not be able to rely as much on convection and radiation to get rid of that heat, and we have to start relying on evaporative cooling. So that evaporative heat loss is using that the heat from the blood coming up to the skin, as well as some of the heat from the environment that is in close proximity to the body, is going to lead to the evaporation of that sweat, which draws that heat away. So again, it's the evaporation of the perspiration, not the actual sweating, that is going to do the cooling. But we're going to use that heat from the body to try to evaporate this. And again, at that point, if you're moving and there's some convection as well, that will increase that heat loss through evaporation at a higher rate. But again, it's usually when the temperatures are much warmer is when we're going to have to rely more and more on evaporative cooling. Honestly, in extremely hot environments, it is the main way, and probably one of the few ways we're actually going to be able to dissipate heat in hot environments, especially if exercising in hot environments. And this just kind of shows that trade-off, where you can see rate of heat you're producing. This is kind of just like watts and some other stuff here. I'm not really worried about this, but the main thing is you can see metabolic rate. We have a steady state of heat loss. But what you can see is it goes from radiation and convection and conduction, and those ones that are sensible heat loss. As the ambient temperature increases, you can see it becomes insensible heat loss, becomes the much bigger contributor to dissipating that heat. And this insensible heat loss is going to be with our different types of sweat glands. So if we're looking at sweat glands, I'm not so worried that you know about the apocrine sweat glands. This is a lot more lipids, more odor producing, pheromones, that type of thing. They make their secretion by having part of the cell disintegrate. They're those apocrine sweat glands. When we're talking about thermoregulatory sweat, we're really looking at eccrine glands, which are the merocrine producing sweat glands. So merocrine, these are the ones that are making vesicles of sweat that go to the surface and are released. Mainly water. It's going to have some electrolytes and a few other things in it. Usually no odor to this, shouldn't have any color to it. We have a lot of sweat glands on the soles of our feet and a few areas on the body, found throughout the body, honestly. Back is usually one of the first ones to start sweating. Again, we want the areas that are going to be able to dissipate the most heat to probably start sweating first. So a lot of times you'll see the back start sweating earlier. Back and chest are usually going to be your first few things to sweat, even though they don't have as many sweat glands. And the reason for that really is that they're the biggest surface area. So you're using a larger surface area to dissipate that heat. And this kind of shows that idea right here, the sweat rate, and comparing it at different temperatures. And you can see it's really the back and chest that are going to be the first two things that kick in order to try to dissipate heat with the sweat rates there. And then you can see as we go further along, it's going to be the abdomen, the legs, the arms, where those start coming in. Forehead tends to be pretty early on as well. And the other thing you kind of see in this one is usually you're going to have this big increase in sweat rate initially. But again, if we're going to reach a steady state, it then turns into we've kind of started matching the amount of heat we're producing. And you'll see this steady state of sweat rate that is going to try to maintain this. And again, this is assuming on all this that you have the hydration status necessary to continue the sweating. That can be a big issue if you don't. And really, people that are sweating more tend to have larger sweat glands that produce more sweat per gland. Usually have more of the coiled part of that is going to be making this. They usually are also most sensitive to the acetylcholine signaling necessary to trigger the sweat glands. The other thing with this is they have a reduced hydromyotic effect. And a hydromyotic effect is really when you are sweating, when your skin gets wetter, you decrease sweating a little bit more. So main thing on this one is these folks that have a hydromyotic effect, so the hydromyotic effect, again, it says at the bottom, increased skin wetness decreases sweating. They have, people that swim more tend not to have adapted to that yet and tend to produce more sweat at a given temperature, even though the skin's already wet. And again, the main thing on this one is if you're producing more sweat than you can evaporate, or at least way more sweat than you can evaporate, you're wasting it in reality. If the sweat is still liquid and it falls off your body, that is not doing any cooling. So we want this hydromyotic effect, that wetness, to kind of decrease your sweating so you're not over sweating. In reality, over sweating just means you're losing that cooling potential of that if the sweat is actually falling off your body. And again, just like everything else we talked about with the temperature stuff here, sweat rate is dependent upon those core and skin temperatures. Again, there's going to be some threshold given a particular core temperature and a given skin temperature. There's going to be some threshold that kicks on that sweating. Generally, the hotter the skin temperature is relative to the core, the lower the core temperature increase is needed to bring about that increasing sweat rate. Usually, and this is most of the times the case, we are able to dissipate as much heat as we're generating in a particular environment so we can maintain our cooling. We don't bring on a lot of heat storage on this one. If we're not able to do that, we can get to these hyperthermic type of things here where we can get heat strain, heat stroke, and that can be definitely a major issue that you have to worry about, especially when it comes to exercising in hot environments or very hot environments. Some of those days when they're talking about heat warnings, I mean, that's where you have to start worrying about some of this, where it might be, feels like temperature over 100. If you're out and active in that, you are going to struggle to dissipate enough heat. So we'll take a little break on this one here, and then we'll come back and talk really about heat stress and some of the issues with that. So we'll see you again next time.